King Edmund sat in the far corner of Rosemore Gardens, beneath the skeletal branches of a chestnut tree, where the shadows were long and the silence was honest. The late afternoon breeze tugged at the collar of his tailored coat, but he didn't move. His tea, long since gone cold, rested untouched beside him on a stone table mottled with moss. The garden had always been his refuge, but on this day the birds seemed quieter, and the hedges whispered of unrest. He had always known that Prince Henry was different. Sensitive, emotional, endlessly questioning. Even as a boy he had clung to stories of ordinary life, what it was like to ride the subway, to visit the market, to live without the ever-present shadow of duty. Edmund had thought it a phase. One day the boy would grow into the royal mold, but time had proven otherwise. The more Henry aged, the more restless he became, and when he met Marian of Westvale, the actress with a sharp mind and a sharper gaze, the king had felt something shift, not in the nation but within his own walls. What began as small signs missed protocol, murmured complaints, subtle distance soon formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. At state dinners, Henry no longer lingered by his father's side. He watched the room with an air of detachment, his expression stiff when courtiers offered praise for the monarchy. Marian, always elegant, always poised, began to withdraw from royal events altogether, citing the pressure, the unfair scrutiny, the outdated expectations. Edmund had smiled through it all, holding firm in his role as the unshaken monarch, but the silence between them had become unbearable. In private, he reviewed letters Marian had written to the palace aides, stern, pointed, and tinged with hurt. He studied Henry's few public appearances with a scholar's scrutiny, parsing his son's every word for signs of deeper resentment. Edmund had spent decades safeguarding the image of the crown. Now, with his own blood pulling away, he wondered if he had misunderstood the very legacy he had fought to preserve. He remembered the night they had told him of their plans to step away. Not in the throne room, not in the council chamber, but here right in this very garden. Henry had stood, not like a prince delivering a formal statement, but like a man exhausted by expectations. There had been no shouting, no slamming of fists, only a soft, almost apologetic delivery of their decision to seek peace elsewhere. And then they had walked away, Marian's hand tucked lightly around Henry's arm. Since that day, Edmund had returned to this bench often, perhaps hoping for a different ending or for time itself to reverse. But the garden, like the monarchy, moved forward with or without its loyal stewards. All he could do now was watch and wait for the next move, the next reveal, the next blow he would absorb behind a mask of composure. And so he sat, silent and still, the cold creeping in through his gloves, the weight of legacy pressing deeper into his shoulders. The morning the trailer aired, King Edmund did not rise at his usual hour. The palace staff, trained never to question, moved with quiet efficiency, but even they noticed the change. The thumphones. Curtains in his chambers remained drawn. The breakfast tray went untouched. In the command wing, Lord Alaric Montfort had already summoned the communications advisers. They had all seen it by then, the glittering, perfectly edited trailer released by Prince Henry and Duchess Marian, full of intimate footage and heavy insinuation. What unsettled Edmund most was not the content itself, but the timing. Just 4 days had passed since Queen Adriana's memorial, his wife, their mother, the heart of the dynasty. The kingdom had still been cloaked in mourning. And yet, here was his son, pushing a narrative to the world stage. Polished interviews, slow-motion clips of tearful moments, dramatic pauses framed by orchestral swells. It was, Edmund realized, a declaration not of independence, but of battle. Later that day, he sat alone in the Windsor Library, the heavy doors closed, the news clippings spread out across the table. One headline called Henry a truth-teller. Another painted the palace as a fortress of cruelty. A third asked if the monarchy had lost its moral compass. He stared at each one in silence, the room filled only with the ticking of the grandfather clock near the hearth. Edmund had always known the media could be cruel, but this was different. This was strategic. The couple had not stumbled into a scandal. They had curated one. And worse still, they had done it with access he himself had. Granted, security stipends, residence allowances, diplomatic connections. He had opened those doors with the hope of preserving family, and now those very gifts were being repackaged as chains they had escaped. That evening, he requested a report, a full account of the interviews, who had been consulted, what was shown, and how it had been obtained. He learned of the behind-the-scenes staff who had once served at Buckingham, now paid consultants for Henry's media team. A gardener who had overheard conversations. A junior aide who had forwarded emails. It was death by 1,000 leaks. In a rare moment of unchecked emotion, Edmund struck the edge of the oak table with his cane, the sound echoing off the paneled walls. Then he steadied himself and called for Prince Alastair. The heir arrived within the hour, crisp and composed as ever, but he too had seen the footage. They spoke without flourish, their conversation clipped and deliberate. Alastair suggested a counter-narrative. Edmund refused. He had no interest in entering a media war, not yet. Instead, he issued a directive to the Royal Press Office. Silence. No comment, no rebuttal. Let the public see the difference between noise and dignity. But inside, he feared he had already lost something intangible. Respect, perhaps. Or control. Or the image of his son that he had long protected. That night, he walked the palace halls alone. The portraits of former kings looked down upon him, their expressions frozen in oil and legacy. He paused before one, the founder of the modern line, a man who had survived rebellion, exile, and betrayal. Edmund wondered if the same blood flowed in his own veins. If so, he would need it now more than ever. Weeks turned to months, and the storm that had erupted after the trailer refused to pass. King Edmund, once the centerpiece of statecraft and ceremonial unity, found himself increasingly relegated to the margins of his own reign. The headlines did not relent. They rolled in like waves, each one bringing fresh analysis, speculation, and dissection of Prince Henry and Duchess Marian's life in Montevideo. Their new world was sunlit and curated, filled with vineyard visits, glossy photo shoots, and podcast episodes that hinted, never directly accused, always hinted at deep injustices committed behind palace walls. Edmund had not listened to the episodes himself, but Lord Montfort did. The reports were always delivered the same way: calm voice, clipped words, eyes avoiding the king's. In one episode, Marian recounted a curious question about her unborn child's appearance. In another, Henry mused on the generational trauma of royal men. They never used names. They never had to. The world had already filled in the blanks. Inside Buckingham Hall, the king's household tried to hold the line. New charities were launched. Youth programs expanded. Prince Alastair undertook more public duties. But it all felt muted, overshadowed by the relentless glow of California glamour and controversy. Even seasoned aides began to waver. The younger staff whispered about reform. Public opinion was no longer just divided, it was tipping. Edmund knew the tide had turned the morning he read a piece in an American newspaper. It described him as an out-of-touch monarch, hiding behind pageantry while his son embraced authenticity. The words stung more than he cared to admit. He closed the paper and left the room without finishing his tea. As summer approached, the king began to shrink from public engagements. The palace released statements citing health preservation, but within the private corridors, everyone understood. The betrayal was not just political, it was personal. His own flesh and blood had recast him as a symbol of everything they sought to escape. The heartbreak of it was not loud, not dramatic. It was slow and corrosive, like water wearing down stone at night. Edmund often stood at the balcony outside his chambers, watching the gardens below where he once walked with Henry as a boy. He remembered the little boy asking about the constellations, pointing to Orion's belt with eyes full of wonder. That memory, bright and innocent, now clashed with the reality of the man who had turned away so completely. And yet, even as pain etched new lines across his face, Edmund did not lash out. There were no public accusations, no desperate attempts to reclaim favor. His belief in dignity had been forged over decades. It would not crack under the strain of gossip and glitter. But in solitude, he allowed himself moments of vulnerability. The quiet sighs, the slow pacing. The letter he started to write and never finished. Lord Montfort once found him sitting alone in the royal chapel, eyes closed, hands folded, but not in prayer. Just stillness, a moment of searching, for strength, for understanding, for peace. Outside the walls of the palace, the world turned faster. Inside, the king aged quietly. Not from years, but from wounds no crown could shield him from. The summons came without fanfare, slipping into the palace through official channels, but bypassing public knowledge. Prince Henry had requested a private meeting with King Edmund, no advisers, no press, no Duchess Marian. The message was brief, almost reluctant, but its implications rang louder than any speech he had ever given. For a moment, Edmund stared at the letter longer than necessary, the folded paper trembling slightly between his fingers. Then he instructed his valet to prepare Balmoral. The Scottish estate had always been Edmund's sanctuary. Far from the political noise of London, surrounded by fog and pine, it was a place where truth often found its voice. He arrived 2 days before Henry, walking the halls with slow, deliberate steps. The portraits of ancestors looked on in silence. He spent the evening in his study, not reading, not writing, just sitting by the fire. Waiting. When Henry finally arrived, there was no procession, no photographers hiding in the woods, only the soft hum of an engine as a single black car rolled up the gravel drive. Edmund watched from the drawing room window as his son stepped out, shoulders stiff, eyes lowered. The moment was neither dramatic nor tender. It was something more fragile, a recognition that too much had passed to pretend, and yet something had brought him back. They met in the blue room. No one else entered. The door closed behind them, and for 6 hours the palace fell into a strange hush. Stewards moved quietly in the corridors, guards kept a respectful distance, and Lord Montfort waited outside, glancing at his pocket watch but asking no questions. Inside the room, words were exchanged, not as king and prince, but as father and son. Regrets surfaced, not as confessions but as acknowledgments. Henry spoke more than Edmund expected. Edmund listened more than Henry ever remembered. When the door opened at last, they emerged changed. The king looked older, yes, but lighter. His walk steadier. Henry said little as he left, but he paused before stepping into the car. He looked back at the estate, as if taking something with him or perhaps leaving something behind. 3 days later, a statement was released from Henry's office. It was brief, carefully worded, and strikingly respectful. He praised his father's resilience, his quiet guidance, and expressed a renewed desire to engage with family matters, albeit from a distance. Marian's name was not mentioned. Speculation erupted, of course. The press dissected every line. Some claimed a deal had been made silent in exchange for favor. Others insisted it was the beginning of a strategic retreat. But inside the palace, Edmund asked for no such interpretation. He returned to London the following week and resumed his duties, still cautious. Still weary, but with a faint shift in his bearing at court, people noticed subtle changes. He lingered longer in the nursery where Prince Alistair's children played. He resumed his walks in the garden, passing the old stone bench without stopping, but without avoiding it either. He even appeared at a youth summit, delivering a speech that, for the first time in months, carried warmth rather than formality. The betrayal had not vanished. The hurt remained, but so did something else, a fragile thread of restoration. Edmund understood better than most that forgiveness did not mean forgetting. It meant choosing legacy over bitterness. And while the world watched and speculated, he quietly made his choice. The king would carry on not as a man unbroken, but as one who had learned to stand even after being bent by the storm.